Let's go ahead and enable MVC in our project. We talked about this earlier that ASP.NET 5 can do a number of things, but we're opting into each of the successive features we want. We're growing the size of this application as we have different services we want, and MVC is certainly part of that. So we go down to our startup. We'll want to actually use configure services to add MVC to the services that we can use in our application. And so we want to make a call called add MVC. Add MVC, like those other elements we saw a minute ago, isn't being included here, and that's because we haven't brought in the NuGet package yet. We haven't configured this project.json to include that. Now we could certainly open up our project.json and add it here as one of the dependencies. But inside of Visual Studio, we can shortcut this by just using the helper over here. And it knows, oh, add MVC is in this package, and we're using beta 7. If I just click on that, it's going to go ahead and add that project in for us. In fact, if we look at project.json, we'll see it added MVC as a requirement. It put it first because by default, when we're adding them automatically, it's alphabetizing them. So now that services have the MVC interfaces associated with them, we can use them in other contexts. And this is an important idea that we really haven't touched on. In the startup, there are two methods. One is configure services, and this is really configuring the dependency injection container, all the different kinds of services that we're going to use across our application that we can request as necessary to be injected into certain parts of our application for simplicity. And that's all we've done here is say, grab all of the MVC associated services and put them into the service container. Down here in configure is where we actually have to turn on MVC. We've enabled it inside of our project, but we haven't turned it on. We can do that with app.useMVC. So here we're telling it go ahead and expect to be listening for requests in the style of MVC. Now that we've included MVC as well, we can go back to our controller and we can fix these up. The first thing we'll want to do is derive from the controller class. And we can use control period to go ahead and add that using up in our project as necessary. Now that we've included this, it knows about iActionResult and knows that returning a view will correctly try to search out that view for us. If we go over to our view again, we'll see that ViewBag is now supported and that we're getting all of that resolved. And all of this happened because we were missing the MVC assemblies in our project. Let's go ahead and run this briefly. When we go to this home page, we're not getting the result we might expect. We might expect it to be looking for that controller and view that we asked for, but we've not actually told it what we want to listen for. Let's do that next. Inside the call for use MVC, we can actually supply it a callback that will configure the routes. And so let's just use a lambda for that. I'll say config, and then let's just put a code block here and say config dot map route, and then we're going to supply the route for us. This has a number of different properties that we care about, but we'll go ahead and use the style of using the name of the parameter to simplify it. So I'll just call this our default route. Our template will be controller action ID. Let's talk about what that template is. When a request comes in, it's trying to do a pattern match based on all the templates it sees in these mapped routes. A route is some instructions for how to take a URI coming into a request and map it to some code, normally a controller. So here we're saying that the template's going to be the name of the controller, which is going to be app, the name of the action, which will be index, and then an optional ID. And that question mark tells the route definition that the ID is not required. And then we'll set up some defaults as well. So the defaults are just going to be a new anonymous object that define the items in the template if they're not supplied. So I'm going to say controller. If one isn't supplied, we're going to assume that we're looking for the app controller. And if an action isn't supplied, I'm going to assume we're looking for the index action. And that's where these are mapped. I don't have to actually specify a default for the ID because we're already telling it that it's optional. And if the ID isn't used, it's not going to be part of that map. So what happens here? If we build this and go over to our browser and we give it the controller name, app, and give it our view name, index, it's actually going to bring us to the HTML that was defined in that view. Now it doesn't look right because our CSS and our JavaScript is missing, but we'll delve into why that is in just a moment. By saying app/index, what we were telling it was match a route I have using those semantics. So right after the root of the server is going to be some name of a controller, some name of an action, and it's going to tell MVC to find a controller with that name, and in our case that's an app controller. Conventionally it's going to be the name of the controller with the word controller after it, just like we created here. And then the action is going to be the method I'm going to try to match. Here's that method called index. And because ID wasn't supplied, it didn't expect to be looking for a method that had a parameter for the ID. We could certainly have another method here that took an ID and would map if someone specifically put an ID after app and index. And later on we'll be using these routes a little bit more so you can understand that. But what happens when I don't have anything after the server name, just the root? In that case, it's taking us to a view, but is it the correct view? It is, in fact, because we're seeing that the title is including that home page element. Why is that working? That's working because we told the route that if the controller isn't supplied, assume it's the app controller. Use that as a default. And if an action isn't supplied, assume it's the index action. And so these are the default properties, so when we have none of them supplied, we're telling it that the root of our page should be app and index. But let's delve into one more particular oddness about this. In the browser, when we go to the root here, our website looks correct. In fact, all the little pieces work just like it did when it wasn't in a view, but it was just a plain old HTML file. The reason it works here is because when we look at the view, we have certain links here that assume that we're at the root of the website. These assume that we're going from the URL we're at that we got here, and we're looking for CSS/site. And this is true for the images, this is true for the scripts as well. They're assuming that we're all going to be at the root of this www root, which was true in the beginning. But what happens is when we go to essentially the same view by saying app index, we're still getting the HTML structure returned, but it's failing to find everything else. And why is that? It's failing, and I'll just use CSS as an example because this is the link to the CSS. So when it's trying to find it, it's literally assuming it's going to be at this address, right? The name of our page /CSS/site, which of course it isn't in there. It's way back down here at the root. So how do we solve this? Inside Razor Pages, there's a special syntax here, and it starts with a tilde and then a slash. And this effectively tells ASP.NET MVC that you want to go to the root of wherever this project is hosted and start looking for the elements there. Now we could get away with just using a slash, assuming we were always hosting this at the root of a web server like this. But with the way that hosting goes, we could certainly have our entire site under our site, and then that root pathing won't work. The convention here is whenever you have these relative paths to resources that are in www root, go ahead and prefix them with tilde/. And let's go ahead and fix all of these with tilde/. There's only a couple of them. I'm using images, and I think the only other ones are the scripts. So this is telling it how to find those by going to the root of the site, the www root, and then finding those resources. If we refresh this with our app index, we can see it now works. In both cases, it's going to get those resources in the right place because both of those URIs actually map to the same controller and view. We're going to have a couple of different pages as represented by these different links here. How do we go ahead and make these pages all share some of the same commonality, like the sidebar, maybe the footer, maybe a to be used later header? How do we reuse those elements? Let's do that next in the next video.